Welcome, weary traveller of thought and time. Let the weight of the present moment settle gently beside you as we step backward, unhurried, into the dim gaslit streets of Victorian London. Tonight's journey will not follow kings or great battles, nor linger in golden halls or echo with the names etched in history books. Instead, we drift through alleyways, softened by fog, toward lives often unseen, voices muffled by propriety and shame, but no less real, no less human. In this gentle exploration, we'll glimpse the lives of women who lived and laboured in the shadows of the 19th century's industrial ambitions brothel workers in the Victorian era. Their world, often whispered about in parlours or obscured behind euphemism, was neither glamorous nor purely grim. It was a daily negotiation of survival, routine, constraint, and fleeting agency. Not the scandalous tales of the penny dreadfuls or the romantic illusions of modern television, but quiet, steady truths' lives, folded in on themselves like lace tucked into drawers. You'll imagine, perhaps, the softness of worn linen sheets, the creak of wooden stairs, the musty smell of old wallpaper, and the echo of footsteps in long corridors. You'll hear the city-distant horse-drawn carts, the low murmur of gas lamps hissing in the mist. This is not a tale of drama. It is a study in stillness, of what it meant to live day to day, to work, to sleep, to endure, to laugh sometimes, and to wait for evening, for clients, for change, for peace. So lay back now. Let your thoughts wander like fog down cobbled streets, and we'll begin our slow descent into the unnoticed world of a Victorian brothel worker. The life of a brothel worker in Victorian London began not with sunrise, but with silence. Mornings, for many women in such establishments, arrived slowly and without ceremony. There was no bright opening of windows or cheery bustle of household duties. Instead, the rooms remained dim, curtains drawn against the light, with air thick from the previous night's use-coal smoke, cheap perfume, body heat, and dampness seeping in through old brick and uneven flooring. The brothels themselves were varied. Some were opulently kept for upper-class clientele, others barely more than lodging houses with a purpose. In any case, the basic structure of a day was similar. After the last client had left, often near dawn, house would lapse into a brief, uneasy stillness. The women would sleep late into the morning, not out of leisure, but necessity. Sleep was shallow, broken by the street noise or the creaks and whispers of the house. Upon rising, the women tended to small personal rituals. There was often no hot running water. Instead, pitchers of tepid liquid were poured into basins, the surface of which steamed faintly in winter. Washing was done quickly, quietly. Clothes were shaken out, sometimes still damp from being rinsed the day before. Hair was brushed into something tidy, or at least passable, though lice and dandruff were common nuisances. No one lingered too long in preparation. They knew the real effort would be needed later. Midday in the brothel was a liminal time. Some houses operated in the afternoon, especially those with more desperate clients or more destitute workers. Others kept the daylight hours quieter. In that silence, the women might write letters they never sent, mend worn chemises, or sit idly by the hearth, feet tucked beneath them, eyes half-lidded with fatigue. There was rarely conversation of any depth, just occasional muttered complaints about illness, a missed meal, or a particularly disagreeable client from the night before. Meals were sparse and inconsistent. Brothel keepers, who managed the women and controlled the flow of money, often took a large share of the women's earnings, leaving just enough for sustenance. A bowl of thin gruel or bread with lard might constitute breakfaster, perhaps nothing at all if the rent was late. Food arrived, not at mealtimes, but when money did. In the more refined houses, there might be meat pies or roast scraps from the cook's own table, but even there, hierarchy reigned. Newer or less favoured women might eat last. By mid-afternoon, the preparation began anew. Lamps were cleaned and filled with oil. Beds were remade, though always roughly. Fresh linens were rare, and the damp air made drying a challenge. The women might spend an hour stitching a torn hem, applying coal dark powder to their eyelashes, or rubbing colour into cheeks gone pale from fatigue. Scented oils, mostly inexpensive concoctions, heavy with muskworm dabbed at the pulse points, meant to mask less pleasant odours that clung to the house like dust. The anticipation of nightfall brought with it a sort of weary tension. The women gathered in a front parlour or hallway, some leaning against door frames, others pretending to read old newspapers or knitting absent-mindedly. Their minds often wandered. Would the regular clients return? Would someone new arrive? Would the keeper be lenient tonight, or exacting? Outside, London shifted from day to dusk. The street sounds changed. The cries of vendors faded, replaced by the sharp clatter of carriage wheels, the footsteps of men heading home or out into the night. The city, in its peculiar Victorian rhythm, became darker but somehow more alive. In the brothel, candles were lit. Gas lamps hissed faintly. The illusion of warmth and welcome was staged curtains pulled back just enough, a bowl of wilting flowers adjusted, lace doilies fluffed. The front room smelled of old upholstery and perfume. A worn piano in the corner was occasionally played by one of the girls who knew a tune, but often it stood silent, dusty, slightly out of tune. There was no single rule for how the night would unfold. It might begin slowly, with long hours of waiting, or there might be a sudden flurry of arrivals, gentlemen of business, labourers with wages in their pockets, travellers unfamiliar with the city. Each arrival brought movement, doors opening, whispered names, hurried adjustments of bodices or garters, and so the rhythm repeated. Evening blurred into night, into early morning. The work began not with fanfare, but with a knock, a request, a transaction, and afterward, the return to rooms barely cooled from the previous presence, to lie down and begin again. These were the days of the Victorian brothel worker, not filled with intrigue or catastrophe, but shaped by monotony, caution, and fleeting moments of human connection or escape. The cycle was endless, slow, and quietly draining, and as the night deepened outside their windows, and footsteps on the street grew fewer, they too faded back into uneasy rest, waiting for the next dusk to pull them once more into motion. Now that you've glimpsed the slow cadence of a single day, let us ease into the lives behind these daily acts. In the next segment, we'll gently step into the biographies of these women, their origins, their choices, or lack thereof, and how they found themselves behind those creaking doors. As you lie back and breathe softly, picture yourself drifting through the soft haze of time once again, this time focusing not on the daily rhythm, but on the slow and often invisible path that led a woman to the door of a Victorian brothel. There were many such paths, and few of them were chosen freely. The word fallen was often whispered by polite society. To describe such women yet falling implies a single stumble, a drop from grace. In truth, their descent was often long, gradual, and shaped more by circumstance than choice. Some were born into poverty, their lives constrained from the very beginning. In the crowded tenements of London's East End or the soot-streaked mining towns of the north, girls came into the world in families already worn thin by hunger and hardship. Childhood in these places past quickly. Play gave way to labour. Education was rare, and opportunities scarcer still. For many working-class girls, the choice was not between virtue and vice, but between starvation and survival. The loss of a parent could tip the balance. A father's death in a factory accident or a mother's decline from consumption could leave a young girl the sole breadwinner. If she was lucky, she might find work as a laundress, seamstress, or maid. These jobs were exhausting, poorly paid, and offered little stability. Employers dismissed girls without notice, and illness or injury meant immediate unemployment. Worse still, domestic servants were often subject to exploitation behind closed doors. A pregnancy outside of marriage, whether from consent or coercion, frequently spelled the end of any respectable livelihood. And so, for some, the brothel was not a choice made out of desire, but a last resort when every other door had quietly closed. Others arrived from the countryside, drawn to London by rumours of work, or simply driven from their homes by failed harvests and family discord. They found a city that was vast, indifferent, and deeply stratified. Many girls stepped off the stagecoach or train with only a few shillings and the clothes they wore. Alone and unfamiliar with the city, they were easy prey for those who promised lodging and employment, only to lead them elsewhere. Pimps and madams sometimes approached directly, though more often the offer was sotella, a roof, food, protection. The catch came later, when debts were called in, and escape no longer felt possible. There were also women who had once lived lives of modest comfort, daughters of clerks, merchants, or craftsmen, who fell into ruin through bankruptcy, scandal, or a sudden change in fortune. In a society where a woman's value was so often tied to her family's standing, a financial collapse could leave her adrift. Few trades were open to women of the middle class, and fewer still were deemed respectable. To work with one's hands was seen as shameful. To beg was unthinkable. Some of these women entered prostitution quietly, registering under false names, hoping no one from their past would ever discover where they had gone. And then there were those whose stories were less easy to categorize. Women who had been widowed young, with no inheritance or support. Women who had been abandoned by husbands, tricked by lovers, or caught in the slow erosion of social support. A few came willingly, believing they might earn more here than as washerwomen or street vendors. They saw brothel work as temporary, a means to an end, and in rare cases it was. But even those who entered the profession on their own terms quickly learned the limits of agency. Brothel life was not often the glamorous escape that Victorian novels occasionally hinted at. There were rules unspoken or enforced by the madam. There were debts, typically for room, board, or clothing. There was hierarchy among the women, with newcomers often given the worst rooms and the least desirable clients. And always, there was the looming spectre of illness, both physical and emotional, that came with being used, judged, and discarded. Despite this, the women formed quiet bonds with one another. Shared misfortune bred solidarity. A stolen coin might still spark a fight, but illness, loss, or cruelty from a client could bring comfort from a fellow worker. In the small world of the brothel, these connections were sometimes all they had. You might imagine them on a cold night, sitting close by the kitchen fire in the early hours, talking in hushed tones about the past. One remembering her brother's violin, another reciting bits of poetry learned long ago, and a third simply staring into the coals, silent. These were not stories they could tell outside. To most of the world, they were faceless, nameless fallen, but within those walls, they remembered who they once were, and sometimes even dared to imagine who they might still become. As we move forward, keep these hidden histories with you. They add weight and humanity to the lives we continue to explore. In the next segment, we will quietly uncover how the brothel itself functioned, not just as a place of work, but as a tightly managed, structured system that balanced commerce, discretion, and the rigid expectations of Victorian morality. Let us now return, gently, to the setting itself, the brothel as a functioning establishment. In the quiet space between sleep and wakefulness, picture a townhouse in one of London's older neighbourhoods. Its facade is faded, its windows slightly clouded with soot, but it carries the veneer of respectability that Victorian society demanded, even in its more shadowed corners. A lace curtain in the window, a brass knocker, not polished but intact. To the unknowing passerby, it could be the home of a widow or a modest boarding house. That illusion was carefully maintained. Within, the structure of the brothel operated more like a small business than a den of vice. Most were overseen by a madam referred to in formal records as the keeper. She was often a former worker herself, someone who had aged out of the trade, or seized the opportunity to manage rather than serve. Her responsibilities were both numerous and quietly strategic. She coordinated the rotation of workers, managed the finances, paid off local constables for their silence, and ensured the establishment remained clean enough and orderly enough to avoid scrutiny. Every detail, from the furnishings to the schedule, was part of a careful choreography. Brothels ranged from modest to near opulent, depending on clientele and location. The more successful ones featured heavy drapes, patterned wallpaper, and worn but once elegant furniture, a parlour for waiting guests, a small kitchen in the rear, and rooms upstairs designated for the women's use. The less fortunate establishments were threadbare, with straw mattresses and little else. In either case, the layout was designed for discretion: separate entrances, narrow hallways, heavy doors that muffled sound. Money flowed through the house with quiet efficiency, and very little of it stayed with the women. Clients paid the madam directly, either at the door or in the front room. She, in turn, distributed a portion to the workers after, deducting charges for lodging, food, clothing, toiletries, and occasionally invented fines. In this way, many women remained perpetually indebted, no matter how many clients they served. It was not uncommon for a woman to finish a long night with barely enough coins to afford a hot meal the next day. Schedules varied from house to house, but most operated well into the night. Clients arrived by appointment or word of mouth. The madam often played the role of hostess, guiding the visitor into the parlour, offering tea or brandy, and presenting a selection of the women either in person or by name. The choice was always the client's. The women were expected to be available, compliant, and presentable. Resistance was not encouraged, and rest was a luxury, granted only between visits. The madam also acted as the enforcer of decorum. She might dismiss a woman for speaking too freely, refusing clients, or developing attachments. In more affluent brothels, house rules were strict. No alcohol, no visitors outside of business, no fraternizing beyond the professional. In poorer houses, the rules were often just as firm, but unevenly enforced. Much depended on favoritism, on leverage, or on the particular mood of the keeper that evening. The interaction with the outside world was limited but not non-existent. Some brothels had arrangements with local taverns, cabmen, or street hawkers who directed clientele discreetly. Others operated under the quiet understanding of neighborhood police officers who overlooked their presence in exchange for regular payment. This tacit arrangement was a fragile one subject to the whims of morality campaigns, changes in city policy, or shifts in public opinion. Periodically, the brothels would be raided, not so much to cleanse the city of vice, but to remind it of who held power. These raids were often performative. A few arrests might be made, and names printed in the newspapers. Under vague charges of disorderly conduct, the madam might pay a fine or serve a short sentence. The women, however, bore the greater weight of public shame, even as they returned quietly to their rooms afterward. Beyond the business structure, the brothel was also a home of sorts, however impermanent. The women shared space, meals, and silence. They knew each other's routines, the ones who liked to sleep late, those who sang quietly while dressing, the ones who wept alone at night. There were birthdays marked with small gestures, illnesses tended with crude remedies, and occasional laughter shared over stories of particularly eccentric clients. And then there was the constant maintenance of appearances. Clothing was cleaned and mended nightly, shoes blacked with soot if polish was unavailable. Faces were carefully painted, despite the low quality of cosmetics available. Rouge made from carmine beetles, chalk powder, and wax pencils were common. The goal was not just allure, but transformation, becoming someone who might earn more than the woman beneath the makeup. Privacy was rare. Beds were shared in shifts. Rooms were thin-walled, and personal items could disappear in a moment. Still, some women managed small comforts: a tin box with old letters, a shawl from a younger sister, a pressed flower kept between book pages. These items were hidden, protected not just from theft, but from the creeping erosion of self that came with the job. So, behind the whispers and judgments of polite society, the brothel functioned as its own world, a rigid system of survival, commerce, and fragile community. It was not lawless, nor was it glamorous. It was ordinary in its complexity, repetitive in its demands, and precise in its operations. Now that you have seen the brothel as an institution structured, calculated, and often indifferent, let us move deeper still. In the next segment, we'll wander into the realm of mystery and medicine, examining the beliefs, treatments, and superstitions that surrounded women's health, especially in an era that feared what it did not understand. As your breathing slows and thoughts drift further into shadow, imagine yourself moving through the hush of a Victorian back room, a space where time feels suspended. A low cot rests in the corner, its frame iron and unadorned, the mattress worn and sunken in the center. A cracked porcelain basin sits beside it, half filled with cloudy water. The air smells faintly of herbs, sweat, and carbolic soap, though none seem to dominate. This is not a hospital, nor a doctor's office, but rather the improvised sick room of a woman who cannot afford to stop working and yet can no longer stand. The brothel, though organized like a business, had no health insurance, no time off for illness. Women carried the burdens of their bodies like extra weight, silently, often alone, and with as much endurance as they could manage. Illness was expected, though rarely named outright. Exhaustion, recurring infections, fevers, and various unexplained aches were simply part of life. Medicine in the Victorian era was both advancing and oddly stagnant. Hospitals were places of last resort, often avoided for their filth, crowded wards, and high mortality rates. For a brothel worker, being admitted to a hospital often meant being labelled unclean, fallen, or incurable. Instead, many relied on self-treatment, folk remedies, and the rare charitable visit from a nurse or doctor willing to offer discretion. Within the house, there might be a shared collection of tinctures and tonics, bottles with labels faded by time, laudanum for sleep and pain, camphor oil for colds, castor oil for digestive ills. Some mixtures were homemade, teas brewed from pennyroyal, raspberry leaves, or tansy. These herbs were often used to regulate menstruation, to attempt what could not be spoken aloud. Abortifacients, while illegal and dangerous, circulated quietly, sold under euphemistic names at apothecaries, or from women known only by first name. The threat of pregnancy loomed large. Contraceptive methods were unreliable and mostly improvised. Sponges soaked in vinegar, rudimentary sheaths made of animal intestines, and withdrawal were among the few options available. Despite efforts, pregnancies were common and rarely welcome. Some women chose to leave the brothel when their condition became visible. Others were forced out. A few remained, working until they could no longer do so, hiding the changes in their bodies with layers of corsetry and strategic posture. When miscarriages occurred, they were met not with medical attention, but with towels, hot water, and silence. Deaths from complications, though not constant, were not rare. The brothel simply closed the door to the room for a few days, scrubbed it down afterward, and resumed operations. Life continued. The dead were spoken of briefly, then folded away into memory, as if they had merely moved on. But it wasn't all indifference. Within the hierarchy of pain and practicality, care did exist. Women tended to one another as best they could. A cool cloth to a forehead, a spoonful of broth when appetite returned, shared warnings about symptoms or bad treatments. In the absence of formal health care, a quiet sisterhood of resilience formed. Mental health, of course, was not recognized as such. The word melancholy was sometimes whispered, especially about women who grew silent, disinterested, or agitated. Others were said to have nerves, or to be hysterical, terms that served more as dismissal than diagnosis. Remedies included rest, tonics, or sometimes a visit from a physician whose approach leaned more on restraint than empathy. It was easier for society to treat women's emotional suffering as a curiosity than to ask what had caused it. Superstition filled the gaps left by science. Some women wore charms against illness, a coin with a hole drilled through it, a scrap of ribbon from a loved one, or a pouch filled with dried herbs. These items were not shared or explained. They lived in dresser drawers, beneath pillows, or in the folds of dresses. There was no scientific rationale, but faith, however, quiet brought comfort when medicine could not. Disease, especially sexually transmitted ones, was common and largely untreatable. Syphilis, in particular, haunted the brothel world like a silent spectre. Its early signs could be mistaken or ignored. As it progressed, the effects became harder to hide. Yet even then, few sought formal treatment. Mercury, the standard remedy, was as toxic as the disease itself. Some women carried the illness for years, living with its fatigue, pain, and stigma until it claimed them. Their deaths were often undocumented or listed under vague causes, their suffering reduced to a statistic or an anecdote. Still, they endured. They painted their faces, powdered their shoulders, and greeted each client with practiced poise. They walked the narrow line between appearing healthy and not drawing attention. Pain was masked by laughter, illness softened by perfume. The body became both vessel and product tuned to be maintained, presented, and ultimately used. And yet, through all this, there were moments of quiet dignity. A woman sitting alone in the early morning light, brushing her hair, another reading from a tattered book. A few gathered around a cup of tea, their conversation drifting between the mundane and the imagined, the now and the never will be. In this world of limited choices and silent burdens, health, physical or emotional, was not a given. It was guarded, patched together, and mourned in small, solemn ways. And in their private, quiet suffering, the women of the brothels mirrored a larger truth of the era, that Victorian society, so invested in appearances, often ignored what it could not see or understand. Let us now gently turn from the internal to the external, from the women's private pains to their public perception. In the next segment, we'll explore how these women were seen by the society around them, the judgments, hypocrisies, and coded rules of morality that both condemned and concealed their existence. Now, as you settle deeper into quiet, let your mind wander through the fog-laced streets of Victorian London once more, not within the brothel, but outside, among the eyes that gazed at it, without ever truly looking. To be a brothel worker was not merely to endure difficult labour or ill health, but to live under the constant scrutiny of a society that refused to acknowledge the full truth of its own reflection. Victorian society was obsessed with appearances. Respectability, decorum, and moral uprightness were not merely ideals, they were mandates, policed not only by law but by whispered gossip, arched brows, and the fine print of social etiquette. And nowhere was this more sharply drawn than in the way it treated women whose livelihoods, though invisible in daylight, were the silent scaffolding of its darker pleasures. The same men who condemned prostitution in Parliament or the pulpit might visit a brothel on their way home from the club. The same newspapers that lamented the fall of public morals carried advertisements coded in euphemism for companionship or lodging with refinement. The hypocrisy was deeply woven into the fabric of the time, and yet it remained largely unspoken. For brothel workers, the social judgment was absolute. There was no pathway to redemption in polite circles. Once marked, whether by record, reputation, or rumourer, woman was labelled forever. It did not matter how she came to her position, whether she had been abandoned, coerced, or simply born with no better option. Society viewed her as corrupt, degraded, and dangerous. This moral panic was particularly acute during the mid-19th century, when Britain introduced the Contagious Diseases Acts, a series of laws that mandated the medical examination and detention of suspected prostitutes near military bases. The aim, under the guise of public health, was to protect soldiers from venereal disease. In practice, it allowed police to detain any woman they deemed suspicious often, without evidence, and submit her to invasive inspections and confinement. The legislation, while short-lived due to public backlash, reflected the deep imbalance in how society handled vice. Men who sought services were rarely punished. Women, on the other hand, could be imprisoned, fined, or subjected to humiliating procedures, regardless of their guilt or innocence. The laws presumed guilt based not on action, but on appearance, reputation, and mere presence in certain locations. Brothel keepers, too, operated in a liminal legal space. While not always explicitly outlawed, brothels could be prosecuted under vague charges of keeping a disorderly house. Enforcement was sporadic, often dependent on the mood of local authorities or the pressures of a public scandal. A neighborhood might tolerate a brothel for years, so long as it remained discreet. But a single complaint, a political campaign, or a shift in property values could bring sudden closure. The language of morality was everywhere in sermons, pamphlets, and charity campaigns. Women in the trade were frequently referred to in euphemisms: fallen women, unfortunates, soiled doves. These phrases allowed respectable society to talk about them without saying too much, to express pity without acknowledging complicity. Charitable institutions, such as Magdalene asylums and rescue homes, were established to reform such women, though reform often meant rigid discipline, religious instruction, and isolation from the outside world. Some women sought refuge there, others found it more prison than sanctuary. Yet, even as society judged, it consumed. The demand for sex work never vanished, it merely hid in plain sight. Brothels operated within walking distance of churches, theatres, and parliamentary buildings. Some were located near train stations or behind shops. The duality was evident in the very streets of Londonga's lamps, casting both illumination and shadow, voices lowered in daytime that grew louder in night. Children born to brothel workers often faced similar stigma. If acknowledged at all, they were labelled bastards, often separated from their mothers and raised in workhouses or orphanages. Few were given the chance to rise above their birth, though a small number did. For those who remained with their mothers, life was a patchwork of secrecy, resilience, and fleeting moments of maternal affection. And yet, through all this judgment, the women endured. Some cultivated alternate identities when outside introducing themselves as seamstresses, dancers, or companions. A few maintained double lives entirely, spending part of their week working in domestic service, and the other part behind the closed doors of a brothel. These were acts of quiet defiance, or simply adaptation to a world that gave them no quarter. There was no true justice in how they were seen, but even in the shadow of condemnation, many found small ways to assert control through humour, through discretion, through a refusal to let shame entirely define them. They knew the game. They played it because they had to. But inside, many held on to a core untouched by society's glare. And so, as you imagine these women walking through the crowd skirts, trailing through coal dust, gloved hands smoothing errant hair, eyes cast forward with practiced calm, you may also imagine the invisible burden they carried, not only the weight of their own lives, but the weight of being everyone's secret and no one's responsibility. In the next segment, we'll shift our focus to contrast. From the lives in the brothels, we will explore the very different world of Victorian elites, the women who, through privilege, stood on the other side of the mirror. Their restrictions were no less real, though wrapped in silk and etiquette. Together, we will examine the two ends of the same social spectrum and what it truly meant to be a woman in the age of propriety. As the night stretches further and stillness deepens, let your thoughts drift gently upward from the narrow stairwells of the brothel to the grand staircases of the Victorian elite. Here, the air is lighter, tinged not with perfume and coal smoke, but with lavender water and beeswax polish. Heavy drapes keep out the noise of the street, and the rooms are adorned with upholstered chairs, delicate china, and family portraits rendered in soft pastels. A fire crackles politely in the grate. All is order, all is dignity. Yet beneath this elegance lies a different kind of constraint. To be a woman of the Victorian upper class was to be the embodiment of an ideal theangel in the house. She was meant to be gentle, obedient, morally pure, and infinitely patient. Her duties were domestic and social, not economic. Her value rested on her virtue, her family name, and her ability to marry well. The contrast with brothel workers is immediately clear, but perhaps less absolute than it appears at first glance. Upper-class women were protected from physical want, but not necessarily from social suffocation. Their education, when provided, emphasized music, drawing, needlework, and the French language. Science, politics, and independent thought were discouraged. A girl raised in such an environment might be taught to curtsy flawlessly, but never to balance a ledger. Her marriage prospects were her currency, and every conversation, every outfit, and every letter was a kind of transaction. Courtship followed a rigid code. Chaperoned walks, polite letters, and formal dances were the accepted routes to engagement. An improper glance or premature touch could mean scandal. A whisper of impropriety might bar a young woman from marriage entirely. For many, this fear of ruin off being labelled in any way fallen was its own form of prison. Once married, a woman's identity was legally subsumed by her husband's. 1. She could not vote. She could not own property in her name. If her husband chose to control her finances, restrict her movements, or take her children, the law offered little recourse. In this way, the respectable wife and the brothel worker shared an uncomfortable reality. Neither truly belonged to herself. Sex, too, was governed by silence and implication. Respectable women were expected to be ignorant of desire, compliant in the bedroom, and patient in matters of reproduction. Their husbands, meanwhile, often sought satisfaction elsewhere, sometimes in the very brothels that society pretended did not exist. This created a strange, unspoken link between the worlds of privilege and vice. One supplied the illusion of purity, the other, the unacknowledged relief from it. This dynamic was reflected in architecture and city planning. London's neighbourhoods were carefully zoned to separate the classes, but not too strictly. A brothel might exist just a few streets from a society mansion. Servants, messengers, and delivery boys moved between them, carrying glimpses of one world into the other. A corset worn by a courtesan might have been made by the same hand that stitched a debutante's ball gown. Among the elite, there were women who saw this hypocrisy and resisted in quiet ways. Some hosted salons that discussed literature and philosophy. Others became involved in charitable work, not always out of pity, but from a genuine sense of solidarity. Still, these were exceptions. For the most part, respectability demanded distance from vice, from emotion, from anything unscripted. Fashion was another form of social expression. The upper-class woman's wardrobe was both her armor and her cage. Corsets cinched waists tightly, even at the cost of breath and comfort. Petticoats and crinolines added volume and weight. Gloves, veils, and hats added layers of distance from the world. The labor required to dress, maintain appearances, and manage the household's image consumed hours of each day. And always, there was the need to perform. Dinner parties, charity galas, church attendance all offered opportunities to maintain status or risk its erosion. Gossip was currency, and a misstep in conversation could have consequences nearly as dire as a scandal in the brothel world. In a society where women were rarely judged by their minds or abilities, perception became everything. So while the elite woman may have lived surrounded by finery, she too was shaped and constrained by the rigid codes of her time. Her suffering was more veiled, her labor more psychological than physical, but it was no less real. She was expected to endure silently, to never expose the fissures in her life or the pain behind her smile. In both the drawing room and the brothel, women played roles written for them by a culture that placed them in two opposing categories: pure or impure, virtuous or fallen, wife or whore. But beneath the costumes and rituals, many shared the same longing for autonomy, for safety, for recognition of their full humanity. Now that we've traced the outlines of both these worlds, the candlelit shadows of the brothel and the chandeliered salons of the elite, us explore a middle ground. In the next segment, we will gently enter the quiet lives of those in between, the the working-class women, maids, seamstresses, and vendors, whose lives intersected with both realms, yet truly belonged to neither. Let us now settle into a softer in-between, a place less gilded than the parlours of the elite, yet not so hidden as the shuttered rooms of the brothel. Imagine yourself wandering through a narrow street in the early morning. The fog has not yet lifted, and the cobblestones are slick from the night's damp. You pass by shopfronts still shuttered, a baker lighting his oven, and women moving about quietly, shawls pulled tightly around their shoulders. These are the women of the working-class laundresses, seamstresses, maids, street sellers whose lives unfolded in relentless motion and measured silence. Unlike the elite, these women laboured with their hands. Unlike brothel workers, their work was deemed respectable, though scarcely more secure or less exhausting. Their days began before dawn and stretched long into the evening. They rose in rooms cold with draught, dressed quickly in garments mended more than worn, and hurried off to their duties. Every moment of rest was stolen, every coin earned with effort. Take the laundress, for instance. Her day was a choreography of steam and strain. Water was hauled by hand, heated in copper pots, stirred with lye and soap flakes that cracked her skin and burned her eyes. Bending over washboards for hours, lifting and wringing heavy sheets, she returned home sore and soaked. The pay was minimal, and the work ceaseless. Yet society praised her morality, even as it ignored her suffering. The seamstress fared no better, bent over her work from morning until dusk, her fingers red from the prick of needles, her eyes strained by candlelight and detail. She might be commissioned to make dresses for wealthier women, clothes she herself could never afford. A single mistake could cost her not just a wage, but a reputation. Many suffered in silence from headaches, malnutrition, and nervous fatigue, all while appearing neat and compliant. And then there were the domestic servants, a strange blend of presence and invisibility. They lived in the same houses as their employers, but occupied entirely different worlds. A maid might clean the drawing room where a piano stood gleaming, only to sleep in a basement with cracked plaster and a ticking wall clock to mark her short hours of rest. They answered bells without hesitation, ate meals at odd hours, and bore scolding as part of the routine. Their status was precarious. A whisper of insolence, a minor theft, or an unexpected pregnancy, any of these could mean instant dismissal. And with no family in the city or savings to rely on, such dismissal could spell disaster. It was here, at this fragile threshold, that many women slipped into prostitution, not by intention, but by erosion. One day missing rent, one illness, one door closed with finality. Some worked both roles simultaneously, a maid by day, a brothel visitor by night, a seamstress who quietly entertained clients for extra money. In Victorian London, respectability was not always about what one did, but whether one was discovered doing it. The moral line was not always morality, was economic, arbitrary, and often brutally enforced. Children complicated the picture further. Many working-class women were mothers, though few had the luxury of dedicated childcare. Infants were swaddled and left in the care of neighbours or older siblings, while mothers worked without pause. The infant mortality rate in poorer districts was high, not because mothers were indifferent, but because life offered so few protections. Despite the hardship, community ties did exist. Tenement blocks housed families who looked out for one another. Women shared food, remedies, and quiet acts of kindness, a crust of bread here, a needle and thread there, a few pennies passed discreetly in times of need. These were not acts of charity, but survival through solidarity. Religion played a quiet, persistent role in their lives. Many attended church, though more for habit than hope. The sermons often reminded them of sin and salvation, yet rarely addressed the complexity of their daily choices. Still, the rhythm of prayer and ritual offered a kind of structure, a way to make sense of pain and endurance. Education was rare but not absent. Some women taught themselves to read using discarded books or religious tracts. Literacy offered the smallest of escapes, a letter to a distant cousin, a few lines of poetry recalled from school, a message written for someone else who could not write their own. And so they endured, these women between worlds, neither reviled nor revered, neither protected by wealth nor fully cast out. Their lives rarely made it into books or records, but their presence shaped the very fabric of the city. They filled its factories, cleaned its houses, clothed its people, and raised its children. They were the backbone of an empire that saw them as parts rather than people. Now, as the candle burns lower in your thoughts, let us move once more into softer light. In the next segment, we will turn to culture, how brothel life was reflected, distorted, or hidden entirely in Victorian literature, art, and popular imagination. For in the stories a society tells about its women, one may glimpse not just prejudice, but projection. Now, as the hours grow late and your thoughts drift into a gentler pace, imagine yourself seated in a quiet reading room. A book lies open on your lap. The pages are crisp. The candle beside you burns low, and the ticking of a distant clock marks the slow, steady rhythm of night. You are surrounded by shelves filled with Victorian novels, periodicals, and moral tracts, each one a window into how an entire era chose to see itself. In this final exploration, we examine not the lived experience of brothel workers, but their cultural shadow, the way their lives were captured, distorted, or silenced in Victorian literature, art, and social commentary. For in these mirrors, one sees not only the women themselves, but the anxieties and contradictions of the world around them. Prostitution, though pervasive in Victorian society, was largely absent from its most polite literature. Writers like Charles Dickens or Elizabeth Gaskell approached the topic obliquely, if at all often through euphemism or cautionary subplot. A fallen woman might appear as a tragic figure, her misfortunes explained through poverty or betrayal. She was rarely granted interiority or redemption. Her suffering served as a moral lesson, her voice quiet, her fate sealed. Yet, beyond the mainstream, a vibrant subculture of sensational literature thrived. Known as penny dreadfuls or blue books, these cheaply printed works fed a fascination with the lurid and the forbidden. Here, brothels were depicted with dramatic flairdons of sin, opulence, and villainy. The women within were painted as either victims or temptresses, often with exaggerated detail and moralistic tone. These stories were consumed voraciously, particularly by men, who could indulge in scandal under the guise of reading about its dangers. Art followed a similar path. Painters such as William Hogarth, a generation earlier, had created cautionary series like A Harlot's Progress, which charted the fictional downfall of a country girl drawn into London's sex trade. Though technically moralistic, the vividness of the scenes often undercut their intended message, offering a kind of voyeurism under the veil of critique. In the later Victorian period, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood brought a different aesthetic. They portrayed women with luminous skin, flowing hair, and languid expressions models drawn from working-class backgrounds, sometimes from the brothels themselves. Though the paintings were not overtly sexual, they often evoked a sensual melancholy that blurred the line between admiration and objectification. Viewers might not have known the model's profession, but her presence hinted at transgression. The theatre, too, played its role in shaping public perception. Melodramas and morality plays featured archetypes familiar to the era: the virtuous maiden, the corrupt seducer, the fallen woman doomed to despair. Audiences wept at these tales, applauded the redemption of the innocent, and clucked their tongues at the inevitability of sin's punishment. It was performance, both literal and symbolic, a way to process social tensions from the safety of the audience. In contrast, brothel workers themselves rarely had the means to tell their own stories. Diaries and autobiographies were exceedingly rare, not because such women lacked insight or language, but because the publishing world deemed their voices unfit for public consumption. The few surviving accounts, often heavily edited or mediated through male editors, reveal women of wit, resilience, and complex emotion. but their words were filtered, their lives presented as curiosities rather than as chronicles of agency. Censorship also shaped the cultural landscape. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 allowed authorities to seize and destroy materials deemed immoral. This included not only pornography but also medical texts, novels, and sociological studies that touched on sexuality. Writers who attempted to present a more nuanced view of prostitution often faced legal trouble or public condemnation. Even reform literature carried its own biases. Pamphlets distributed by religious charities depicted brothel workers in stark terms, souls to be rescued, lives to be purified. Photographs were staged to emphasize degradation. Women posed in bare rooms, gazing downward, wrapped in plain shawls. These images told a story of pity, but not of strength. They asked for sympathy, but rarely granted respect. Despite all this, the figure of the brothel worker loomed large in the Victorian imagination. She symbolized temptation and ruin, but also resilience and mystery. She was simultaneously everywhere, and nowhere talked about constantly, but rarely heard. And in this silence, society projected its deepest fears and unspoken desires. Some artists and thinkers did begin to challenge the dominant narrative. Writers like George Bernard Shaw and Thomas Hardy pushed against convention, portraying women with greater complexity, hinting at social causes rather than personal failings. But these voices were few, and the tide of moral judgment remained strong. Yet, the brothel workers persisted, not just in the streets and parlours of London, but in the footnotes, the court records, the censored pages, and the half-remembered stories passed from mouth to mouth. Their legacy is one not of infamy, but of endurance. They survived in a society that exploited and erased them, adapting again and again to a world that refused to see them fully. And now, as we draw near the end of this quiet journey, we may reflect not with judgment or sentimentality, but with a calm, steady understanding. These women lived lives full of rhythm and routine, pain and tenderness, silence and survival. They were not symbols, not warnings, not abstract ideas. They were human. In the final segment, we will rest in reflection. We'll gently compare then and now, and consider how far we have come, and how much remains hidden in the folds of our own time.